Why opposition to immigration enforcement has hardened, and what it actually represents. Today on the Morning Report, opposition to immigration and customs enforcement, known better as ICE, has become one of the most persistent and emotionally charged protest movements in American politics. Demonstrations against the agency are no longer rare, localized, or episodic. They are organized, repeatable, and increasingly normalized. ICE facilities have been targeted. Agents are confronted. Enforcement actions are disrupted, and all of it framed as a political disagreement. But it's a moral resistance. What makes this movement different from past immigration debates is not merely the intensity of feeling, but the nature of the opposition itself. The argument is no longer about how immigration law should be enforced, or even which laws should exist. Increasingly, it's about whether the United States has the moral authority to enforce immigration at all. To understand why anti-ICE protests persist and why they have become more confrontational over time, you have to look beyond the surface level explanations, like compassion or partnership. The movement is driven by a convergence of moral framing, ideology, incentives, and cultural conditioning. Many of the participants are sincere. Some are radical. Others are simply swept along by narratives they have not really fully examined. We call them useful idiots. But together they form a movement whose input far exceeds its numbers. What follows in this video are the 5 primary reasons anti-ICE protests exist and endure. They are not ranked by emotion, but by their influence on public perception, policy, and institutional legitimacy. Okay, the single most powerful force behind anti-ICE protests is a fundamental moral reframing of enforcement itself. In previous eras, immigration enforcement was debated as a policy question. How strict should it be? Who should be prioritized? What reforms are necessary? Today, in activist and media narratives, enforcement is increasingly treated as violence by definition. Detention is framed as cruelty regardless of conditions. Deportation is described as exile regardless of legal process. Borders are characterized as oppressive constructs rather than administrative realities. So once this framing takes hold, enforcement is no longer something that can be improved or humanized. It becomes something that must be opposed categorically. And this is why protest rhetoric so often avoids legal detail. Court orders, due process, criminal histories, statutory requirements complicate the moral narrative. It's far easier and far more effective just to focus on emotionally charged anecdotes stripped of context. In this environment, ICE is not an agency enforcing democratically enacted law. It's a symbol of suffering. Most protest participants do not arrive at this conclusion through careful legal reasoning. You think? They absorb it through language, phrases like, no human is illegal. Families belong together. Abolish ICE. It collapses distinctions between lawful and unlawful presence, between civil enforcement and criminal punishment, between discretion and mandate. Once these distinctions are erased, opposition becomes reflexive. This is why even modest enforcement actions provoke outrage. The scale doesn't matter. The principle does. If enforcement itself is immoral, then any enforcement is unacceptable. While most protesters are motivated by emotions or narrative framing, there's a smaller, more ideologically committed faction that operates from a more radical premise that the United States lacks legitimate authority to control borders. This belief is rooted in the delegitimization narrative that frames the country as a fundamentally unjust project. According to this worldview, America's historical sins, slavery, conquest, displacement of indigenous peoples, invalidate its moral claim to sovereignty. Borders are seen not as neutral lines of jurisdiction, but artifacts of oppression. Citizenship becomes exclusionary by definition, and law becomes suspect. It's important to be precise, though. This belief is not widely held by the general public or even by the majority of protest participants. Most Americans, including immigrants, do not believe that the US is inherently evil or illegitimate. However, this ideology exerts outside influence because it dominates activist leadership, academic discourse, and nonprofit advocacy spaces. These true believers do not seek to reform ICE, they seek abolition. Abolition. They are not arguing about priorities or procedures. They reject the premise that enforcement should exist at all. And for them, ICE cannot be fixed because it is enforcing an immoral system. The significance of this group lies not in its size, but in its coherence and cohesiveness. Movements are often guided by their most disciplined minorities. Even when the broader protest space does not consciously reject sovereignty, it adopts the language and tactics of those who do. Over time, this shifts the boundary of acceptable debate. What begins as protect families evolves or devolves into dismantle borders. What begins as protest evolves into obstruction. The end state is not reform, but institutional delegitimization. Now, not all opposition to ICE is ideological. A substantial portion is driven by material incentives. Entire sectors of the American economy depend on illegal labor, precisely because it's vulnerable. Workers without legal status are less likely to complain or organize or demand higher wages. Industries such as agriculture, construction, food processing, hospitality, and domestic services benefit from the workforce that exists in legal limbo. Enforcement threatens that arrangement. We've heard it. Well, who's going to tend to our yard if you send all the Mexicans back? You can go to Home Depot, buy a damn lawnmower. For these interests, opposition to ICE is not about morality, it's about cost. At the political level, weak enforcement produces its own incentives. Large populations of non citizens increase demand for public services. They expand bureaucratic authority and justify continued federal nonprofit funding. Sanctuary policies often attract grant money, political capital, and national attention. Disorder becomes a resource. Anti-ICE protests serve as leverage in this system. They raise the political cost of enforcement while insulating beneficiaries from accountability. When enforcement becomes controversial, lawmakers retreat, agencies hesitate, and the status quo persists. This dynamic explains why enforcement is often opposed to most aggressively in places far removed from the consequences. Affluent neighborhoods rarely experience wage suppression, overcrowded schools, or strained emergency services. However, working class communities do. Yet their concerns are frequently dismissed as secondary or abstract moral narratives. In practice, anti ICE activism often speaks over the people most affected by illegal immigration, not for them. Another major driver of anti ICE protests is the modern media environment. Immigration enforcement is procedural, bureaucratic, and slow. Protests, however, are immediate, visual, and emotionally charged. A deportation order can take years. A confrontation outside an ICE facility can be live streamed in seconds. Media incentives favor the latter. Activist organizations understand this dynamic. Protests are staged for visibility. Language is sharpened to be viral. Conflict, of course, is amplified. Nuance is treated as weakness. The goal is not to explain the law, but to provoke a reaction. This creates a feedback loop. Outrage generates coverage. Coverage generates donations. Donations fund more outrage. Outrage generates coverage. Coverage generates donations. Donations fund more outrage. Outrage, you get it, right? So within this ecosystem, compromise is framed as betrayal. An acknowledgement of enforcement necessity is treated as moral failure. Politicians, of course, quickly learn that silence is safer than nuance. Media outlets learn that spectacle outperforms substance. Over time, the public discourse becomes dominated by extremes. The result is a false binary: enforcement or compassion, cruelty or chaos. The possibility that a nation can be both lawful and humane is crowded out by narratives that thrive on conflict. All right. A final, often overlooked factor is psychological. Because for decades, immigration law in the US has been enforced unevenly. That inconsistency created expectations. Many people came to assume that enforcement was just symbolic, selective, or temporary. The laws existed, but the consequences were negotiable. So when enforcement became real, when agents showed up, when the court orders were executed, and when removals occur, the reaction is shock. Anti-ICE protesters are often less about policy than about disrupted assumptions. Participants frequently believe enforcement will target others, not people they know or identify with. When that belief collapses, protests become a way to reassert the old norm: rules, but no consequences; laws, but no enforcement. This mindset is not unique to immigration. It reflects a broader erosion of respect for law across institutions. Once selective enforcement becomes normalized, consistent enforcement feels unjust. Authority itself becomes suspect. So, in this context, ICE becomes the focal point for a deeper cultural tension, whether law exists to be applied or merely referenced. All right. What all this shows: anti-ICE protests are not driven by a single cause. They are a coalition of motives: moral framing that treats enforcement as harm, ideological rejection of sovereignty by a very small but influential minority, economic and political incentives that reward weak enforcement, media systems that profit from outrage other than solutions, a public that's been conditioned to expect rules without consequences. The danger is not protest itself, because protest is a feature of a free society. The danger lies in the systematic erosion of legitimacy. When law enforcement is treated as immoral by default, and the law itself becomes optional, a nation can be generous without being lawless. It can be welcoming without surrendering sovereignty. But it cannot survive if enforcement is permanently delegitimized by narratives, pressure, rather than democratic process. The real question is not whether immigration enforcement should be humane. It must be. The question is whether a nation can remain a nation if it's no longer allowed to enforce its own laws. And that's not a radical question. That is the most basic question that a republic must answer. My name is Willie Lawson. This is the Morning Report. The Morning Report is a collection of fightbackmedia.com, fightbackmedia.com, fightbackmediatv.com. So until we see you again, go out there and learn something, love somebody, and for goodness sakes, y'all take care of yourself. We will see you when we see you. Bye-bye now.